Within the hour, his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, phoned John Mitchell in New York. Mitchell, now a Wall Street lawyer, would have to raise the money for Hunt's payoff.
Mitchell came down to Washington, and we all met in Bob Haldeman's office. Haldeman had 4 chairs in front of his fireplace. At the very outset of the conversation, Ehrlichman floated just out in the air with the question, has Mr. Hunt's problem been taken care of? And John Mitchell turned to me and said, I don't think that's a problem anymore.
One more envelope stuffed with cash had been dispatched to Howard Hunt.
Mr. Hunt, was there anyone higher up involved in the conspiracy?
I would testify as follows, gentlemen, that to my personal knowledge there was not.
Hunt was not the only danger. There was also the man who had planted the bugs in the Watergate, the security chief of Nixon's re-election campaign, James McCord.
I had told my family that I'd made a mistake in participating in the first place, and I felt the only way to set it straight was to ask my Lord's forgiveness and to tell the truth at the propitious time. Now, my family kept asking me at various times during the next 6 or 8 months, well, is this a propitious time?
That time had come, he decided, the day the Watergate defendants were to be sentenced. McCord wrote to the judge, John Sirica. His letter was the first crack in the cover-up.
He picked up this letter and just sort of held it in front of him, and he began to very slowly read. Item 1, there was political pressure applied to the defendants to plead guilty and to remain silent.
The letter went on to say that perjury had occurred during the trial. Then came his most ominous allegation. Others were involved in the Watergate operation who'd not been identified.
And then he said, well, court's adjourned. And then he just sat back to see what the effect was on everybody of what he had been reading, and it was absolute pandemonium.
Hey, get down. Down.
But McCord hadn't revealed the names of the others he said were involved. The judge had indicated that if McCord wanted to get his sentence reduced, he'd have to talk to the Senate Watergate Committee.
What Judge Sirica has done has made it much more, given us a greater opportunity to get some of the information that might not have been made available by people who, I believe, really have the information.
The Senate hearings weren't due to start for another 2 months. Until then, the committee's counsel was determined to keep whatever McCord might tell him from the press. His main concern was the Washington Post, where 2 reporters, Bob Woodward and his partner Carl Bernstein, had kept Watergate in the headlines, exasperating the White House.
I don't respect the type of journalism, the shabby journalism that is being practiced by the Washington Post.
But it was a reporter on a rival newspaper who had an in with McCord. Bob Jackson had known him socially for years.
McCord always had all the characteristics of what we all associate with a CIA official. It was like pulling teeth to get him to tell you anything.
That weekend, Jackson drove out to McCord's house in search of a scoop. He was welcomed in, but got nothing.
And as I was standing at his front door in my overcoat, ready to say goodbye, the telephone rang. And I heard McCord say something very brief on the phone, yes, no, or I can't talk, or something. And he came back and he said to me, that was Bob Woodward.
He wanted to know whether I had talked with the Senate Watergate Committee.
I said, did you?
Yes, I did, but I didn't tell Bob that, Bob Woodward.
And I said, well, Jim, why didn't you tell me that?
And I said, Bob, you didn't ask me.
Jackson got the scoop that shook the White House. What McCord had secretly given the committee was names. It was bad news for John Dean.
This surfaced my ubiquitous participation in the Watergate cover-up. It was inevitable. As soon as they started down any road, they were going to find me there because I'd been everywhere. So the press was just surrounding my house, and it looked like they were going to camp out indefinitely. And the president called, and he said, well, John, why don't you go to Camp David and get away from it all?
Dean readily accepted the chance to escape to the presidential retreat outside Washington, but Nixon's hospitality had a sting in the tail.
I said that John Dean should make a report. And I said, we have to have a statement.
Dean knew the president needed a scapegoat before the Senate hearing started, and he began to fear he was it.
Oh, he didn't want to do it, of course, because he realized that anything that he wrote that was true would necessarily incriminate himself.
If I put all that I had done in a report, the president, one, could say, well, this is all I ever knew. This is the first time it was ever revealed to me, and use that as a shield, but also use it as a sword against me. So I started walking in the woods up there, and I got to thinking about, what am I going to do when I have to testify? Well, I pulled my oar as hard as anybody in the cover-up. I thought it unfair that I was being asked, in essence, to take the fall, and it angered me.
By the time John Dean returned to town, he had made up his mind he would not be the president's scapegoat. But Dean wasn't the only one to be named by McCord. John Mitchell's deputy, Jeb Magruder, had lied under oath to protect the cover-up. He asked for a meeting to see if he could still rely on his fellow conspirators.
Well, Mitchell's line was that he was going to stick by his story. The line that Dean took was that he was going to tell the truth, whatever that was.
And I listened to Jeb as he was trying to sell me on buying into his story, and I said, Jeb, well, I might have said that, but I didn't say I was going to testify that way. That's a big difference.
The difference, of course, now was that I was the one who had committed perjury, whereas Dean hadn't committed perjury, so I was stuck.
In fact, so was Dean. If he were to avoid perjury when he testified, he would have to confess to his own crimes. As soon as he could, he sought the advice of a top criminal lawyer.
So I told Dean that the thing I was going to try to do was get him immunity. And that is, he could cooperate, but he wouldn't pay the price of a criminal conviction and sentence. And that appealed to Dean.
To get immunity, they'd have to excite the prosecutors with the evidence Dean could offer. When the time came to approach them, some showmanship was called for.
I said, well, I'm going to call up this fellow Glanza. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I guess, and that shocked Dean. It shocked Glanza a little bit more, because when I got him on the phone, I told him I was coming over for a cup of coffee, put the coffee on.
Lo and behold, he showed up at the door, and he was in his bizarre outfit. He had jappers on, and he had a quirt in his hand, and he saw that I was looking at him sort of incredulously, and he said, I'm an equestrian. I ride.
I said to Glanza that his approach was all out of whack, that he was focusing on a second-rate burglary, that he didn't really have a clue as to what happened in the post-burglary events, that my client had all the clues.
And in return for that, he wants immunity, and he deserves it.
He was going to be the key Watergate witness in their prosecution of some pretty big people.
Dean wouldn't talk about the biggest, the president, because he still worked for him. But to get immunity from prosecution, Dean would have to shop Nixon's most powerful associates.
I was in San Clemente with the president and about to get on the plane to fly back to Washington when I had a phone call from John Dean, who, it turned out, was calling to tell me that he had now made plans to go to the prosecutors. I was sort of surprised by this because it was out of the blue, and so I said, well, just remember, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, there's not much you can do about it.
Well, the toothpaste went out that afternoon.